Fristam Pumps is a leading manufacturer of high-quality sanitary stainless steel pumps, blenders, and mixers. FKL shaft and bearings replacement. Before beginning, follow your company's lockout-tagout procedure. Reference the FKL maintenance manual online for additional safety precautions, tool sizes, torque values, and technical information. Tools required: soft-faced hammer, flat screwdriver, socket set with torque wrench, 1/2 inch to 1.5 inch diameter dowel, spanner wrench, adjustable wrench, long Allen wrench set, hydraulic or arbor press, or pre-pressed Fristam replacement shaft assembly, bearing grease, thread compound, thread locker, food-grade lubricant, denatured alcohol, and soft cloth. Gearbox disassembly. Prior to disassembling the gearbox, obtain a gearbox repair kit from Fristam, then complete the pump head disassembly as shown in the seal change video. Place an oil pan under the gearbox below the oil drain hole. Slowly remove the oil drain plug. Slowly remove the vent cap. Let the oil completely drain out of the gearbox and safely discard the oil. Remove the gearbox nuts. Begin to separate the gearbox by turning the gearbox forcing studs counterclockwise with a screwdriver or wrench, depending on forcing stud type on the pump. Once the two gearbox halves spread apart past the gearbox pins, they can be manually separated. To allow the gearbox to lay flat, place it on blocks. Remove and discard the gearbox gasket. Loosen and remove the bearing retainer bolts. Remove the shaft assemblies. Remove the gapping shims and save them. Repeat the process for the other shaft. Remove and discard the front oil seals. Remove and discard the rear oil seals. The shaft hole plug may be reused. Do not remove it unless it is being replaced. Use a screwdriver to remove the rear outer bearing races by pressing them through the shaft holes. Discard the bearing races. Shaft, bearings, and gear assembly. Make sure to keep all bearing components together when removing them from the packaging. They must stay together in matched sets. Position the shaft vertically, with its front end down, on an arbor or hydraulic press. Lightly grease the front bearing step of the shaft. Remove the outer race of the first front bearing. Install the rest of the first bearing onto the shaft, with the larger outside diameter facing down. Secure the bearing by pressing on the inner race. Install the first outer race over the bearing. Install the inner bearing spacer onto the shaft. Install the outer bearing spacer onto the shaft. Remove the outer race of the second front bearing and install it onto the shaft. Install the rest of the second bearing onto the shaft with the larger outside diameter facing up. Secure the second bearing onto the shaft by pressing on the inner race. Note, make sure the outer bearing spacer is flush with the outside of the bearings. Install the front gear spacer onto the shaft. Place the front bearing retainer onto the shaft. Install the gear key. Install the gear. The gears on both shafts must be installed in the same orientation. For example, install both gears with the numbered markings face up. Align the keyway in the gear with the key on the shaft. Install the rear gear spacer. Lubricate the rear bearing step on the shaft. Remove the outer race from the rear bearing and set it aside. The outer race will be installed when the shaft assembly is placed into the gearbox. Install the remainder of the rear bearing onto the shaft. Secure the bearing by pressing on the inner race. Install the bearing lock nut washer with its tabs facing up. Thread the bearing lock nut onto the end of the shaft, but do not torque it. It will be tightened after the shaft is installed into the gearbox. Repeat the shaft assembly procedure for the other shaft. Shaft assembly installation. Clean the gearbox bores and O-ring groove with alcohol and a soft cloth. Press the outer bearing races that had been set aside from the rear bearings into the rear gearbox bearing bores. Install the gapping shims into the front gearbox. Note: a new shaft may require different size shims. When installing a new shaft, it will be necessary to check the gap after the pump is reassembled. Lightly grease the front bearing bores in the front gearbox half. Slide the drive shaft into the gearbox front. Be sure to install the drive shaft back into the original bore. Rotate the bearing retainer so the guideline strip points to the middle of the pump. Rotate the shaft so the timing guideline stripe on the gear points to the middle of the pump. If there is no timing stripe, set the proper timing and mark the gears after the second shaft is installed. Slide the idle shaft into the gearbox front. Rotate the bearing retainer so the guideline stripe points to the middle of the pump. If there is no guideline, turn the bearing retainer so the thinner side is along the inside. Rotate the gear so the guideline stripe points to the middle of the pump. Apply liquid thread locker to the bearing retainer bolts and install them into the bearing retainer. Cross-tighten all of the bearing retainer bolts with the Allen wrench. To check gear timing, slide both rotors onto the shafts. Manually rotate the drive shaft to ensure the rotors do not contact each other. If they do, gear timing must be adjusted. Timing can be adjusted by removing one shaft and rotating its gear to another position. When the gear timing is correct, place a dowel between the rotors to prevent the shafts from turning. Tighten the bearing lock nut on one shaft with a spanner wrench. Use a screwdriver to bend the bearing lock washer tab into one of the slots on the lock nut. Switch the position of the dowel between the rotors to prevent the second shaft from turning. Repeat the process for the second shaft. Remove the dowel. Remove the rotors. Gearbox assembly. Lubricate and install the gearbox forcing studs, but only finger tight. For larger models, it may be helpful to assemble the gearbox on its side. To do this, remove the mounting straps and mounting strap screws. Remove the gearbox hole plugs. Lubricate the gearbox O-ring groove. Install the gearbox O-ring. Install the rear gearbox onto the front gearbox. If it is sticking, lightly spin the shaft to reorient the rear bearings. Warning: do not use excessive force to combine the gearbox halves. This will damage the rear bearings. Note: when reinstalling the mounting straps, orient them as indicated on the straps. Reinstall the gearbox hole plugs. Install the gearbox nuts and tighten to proper torque. Tip the unit back onto the shaft. Lubricate both the inside and outside of the front oil seals and place them into the front gearbox. Align the drain ports to the 6 o'clock position. Ensure that the two halves of each oil seal are installed together and flush with each other to prevent leaking. Wipe the oil seal. Lubricate both the inside and outside of the rear oil seal inside and place it into the drive shaft bore in the rear gearbox. Align the drain port to the 6 o'clock position. If it is new or was removed, install the shaft hole plug in the idle shaft bore in the rear gearbox. Lubricate the oil drain plug with a threading compound and install it in the gearbox. Once the gearbox is assembled, the pump head can be assembled as shown in the seal change video. Gapping. When installing a new shaft, it is necessary to check the rotor gap. With the pump completely assembled, remove the cover to check the rotor gap. Use a feeler gauge to check the gap behind the rotors in several spots. If the gap is incorrect, the gapping shims in the gearbox will need to be adjusted. If the gap is correct, replace the cover. With the vent cap removed, fill the gearbox with oil to the center of the sight glass. Install the vent cap. The pump is now ready to be placed back into service.